the words to this song, which I'm told I don't always enunciate as well as I might, are on the piece of paper on your table. Should have said that. Not there. The people who are there, the people who are there are not there. And the land is empty. The people who are there, the people who are there are not there. And the land is crying. The land is crying. The earth is full of strangers. The earth is full of strangers. They don't know, fire they don't know, air they don't know, water they don't know, and the treasures of the field are lost to their sight. The stars of the heaven are no signs to them at night. Calling of the dove stirs nothing within them. They see no journeys in these signs, and so cannot begin them. Beasts they don't know, birds they don't know, fish they don't know, trees they don't know, and the wind is blowing through, and the trees that shake say, wait. Blowing through you, and through you the silence breaks. Oh, dwellers in the dust, awake and sing for joy, for your dew is a dew of light. On the shadowlands let it fall. Oh, dwellers in the dust, awake and sing for joy, for your dew is a dew of light. On the shadowlands let it fall. Thanks. Well, hopefully some of that made sense, but hopefully it will make more sense when I'm done. And the title of the talk is Breaking the Silence, and the idea behind this is that there used to be a sort of active communion and communication between people and landscapes, and it ain't happening so much anymore. And we're going to look at two different ways of seeing that, you know, that we break the silence by making contact again. And so that would be a case of maybe even listening first and seeing what comes through. But also breaking the silence by attacking the thing that has created the deadness, as it were, the wall that separates us and our communion with the natural world and the land, essentially. So I'll start by asking you a question. Just maybe get a couple of answers. So the question is, do you know where you are? Do you know where you are? Somebody want to just quickly give me an answer to that? Yes?
We're on a giant rock flying through space.
Ah, that's good. Anyone else?
I'm somewhere on a journey discovering who I am in amongst all of the energy that is going on around me. And I've got to say, it is beautifully coming and sitting on my doorstep right here, right now. Thank you.
Fantastic. That's a good answer. So I've got another question now, which sort of turns the previous question on its head. Do you know the person sitting next to you? And I don't need you to answer that. So you see what I'm getting at. So I'm trying to address two different kinds of knowledge here. One is a relational knowledge, where you know someone or something by actually participating in the being of that thing or that person. And then the other kind of knowledge is the knowledge of abstraction. And really what I'm going to look at in the next few minutes is the difference between the kind of world we have when we use those two different kinds of knowledge. And in fact, I'm going to put it to you that the silence that we have is created by walls that separate us from the land, because we predominantly use this second kind of knowledge, which is the knowledge of abstraction. So basically there's going to be I'm contrasting the organism and the machine. We don't have the organism? Yeah, oh, this, right, yeah. I thought this was the, anyway, it's okay. So, as you can see, the organism is all to do with things that are present to one another. Whereas abstraction starts as soon as we start standing outside of the natural world and engaging in something called objectivity. So we separate ourselves from things and then analyze them. And I think there's nothing that could sort of illustrate that better than the scientific approach to studying certain aspects of biology. This is basically an assault on the communion that we have with the world. And biologists studying mice just really show where this is coming from, because they get to the end of the day. I've been reading an account of this in a book I'm reading. They get to the end of the day and they have 3 mice left over. Can you guess what they do with them? They drop them in a blender and pour it in the rubbish. So the scalpel, the pin, the Occam's razor, anything you want to think about, these are actually weapons which are cutting the bonds between us and the land. So I'm going to try and illustrate that through two different kinds of barrier. Actually, no, I'm not. Before I do that, I need to... my business, by the way, is one of the most ill-advised businesses you could imagine, because we have about 450 different products. And I'm afraid I bring the same approach to trying to give a talk. I'm trying to put about 450 different ideas into it. So you'll have to just bear with me. Okay, so foundational idea that I just want to explore for a minute. Mythology, the way we understand the world through mythology and metaphor. In the past, that would have been something which came from our relationship to land. So it would, if you look at any culture, whether it's Christian culture with the Eden myth, or any creation story coming from any culture, their relationship to land has given rise to this story which explains the characters in the story of our lives, and explains who we are and where we fit and how we relate and so on. These days we have science and cosmology that explain all that stuff. But I want to suggest initially that this still is a cosmology that arises from land, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Scientists don't actually find out what they do by the method that I just explained, with a scalpel cutting into things and through experimentation. Experimentation only ever comes as a result of a hypothesis. They already have a view that they're trying to explore and test. Well, the most powerful hypotheses, they come from the kind of dream realm, the same kind of space that prophets and shamans occupy. Einstein is famous for having said that the theory of relativity came to him in a flash of insight, and he saw it. It never came from this kind of scientific method of empiricism. And I want to suggest that the love that is inherent in creation and land, which is the story I'm trying to tell here, that we have a lost communion with landscapes that can be restored. That this same communication of love that came to indigenous people and gave the stories that made sense of the world was land explaining itself to people, and that science itself is just such an utterance that comes from the land to those who have ears to hear. And in particular, I want to explore one particular kind of scientific view. Well, I'm kind of linking a couple of things up, really. So there's the standard cosmology that we have now, the Big Bang theory. And then there's a thing called complexity theory, and that kind of provides the backdrop for everything else I'm going to say with a sort of a modern mythology. So basically, in the beginning, there's this Big Bang, and everything comes out of nothing. But there's not very much there. There's not much diversity. You've got two things. You've got the element helium and the element hydrogen, more hydrogen than helium. But then stars are formed. And in the kind of physics of stars, which I don't pretend to understand, there's a manufacturing of elements. So suddenly we have an increase in diversity. There's now a lot of different chemical elements. Eventually we get to the stage where there's the carbon element on this planet called Earth. And we upgrade the complexity. And all of a sudden, bonds start to form between some of these different elements, and they form something called organic chemicals, which are carbon-based. From there starts to be bonds formed between these different molecules. And eventually, the very first form of life appears. Now, now we're talking about complexity. So complexity theory says that when you have a diversity of units that begin to connect in high quality ways and in a diversity of ways, you have something that occurs called emergence, where something that you couldn't possibly have predicted from the elements in themselves emerges, surprisingly, as if out of nowhere. And of course, we know what's going to emerge with these organic chemicals. It's life. If you were standing there observing, you'd never have said, I know what's going to happen now, any minute now. Those carbon elements and molecules they're going to be a living thing that can self-replicate and all of that. You'd never have predicted it. from there, we have living things that develop, single-celled organisms that develop signaling chemicals that tell them stuff. And then after a while, those more complex organisms that develop nerve cells that use these signal chemicals, and then the nerve cells become nervous systems, and then the nervous systems become more complex. And eventually there's a brain which is even more elaborate. So what you see is a greater diversity of units or elements, different kinds of cells that begin to connect in more and more sophisticated ways, quality and quantity of connections. And then, of course, if you were standing there, you would never have predicted what happens next. But, of course, it's consciousness. Consciousness emerges from this new sphere of connectivity. So then I'll just jump outside and make a thing about processes. So within all of this, living systems emerge, and they have this amazing circular causality that we know. But a machine is not like that. A machine just has singular inputs and singular outputs. And it acts in a linear fashion outside of living systems. But people have attempted to apply this kind of machine idea to living systems. And it doesn't work. So social engineering and just approaches to the ecology, it just doesn't work. So what we need in order to make something good happen, I mean, it almost sounds wrong, like make something good happen, but how do we give ourselves the best chance of something arising out of the diversity of elements that we have in terms of human beings on the planet and other species and just the whole thing? Well, the only thing we can do is to foster a high quality and high quantity of connections or bonds between a diversity of elements. So that gets me nicely set up to say what I was going to say next. Okay, so there's two different kinds of barrier that I'm going to talk about for most of the rest of the time now. One is a semi-permeable membrane. And that allows things to pass both ways. And that's what happens in life. So we're going to talk about a whole bunch of those. The other thing is an impenetrable barrier. And that's what comes out of this abstraction business. So we stop the communication and the two-way flow. So this semi-permeable membrane is basically a point of contact between, we want to say in and out for this, yeah. So between what's in and what's out. Now, depending on which side of the equation you're on, you know, if you're the ecosystem, you're the in, and if you're the organism, you're the out, and vice versa. But you see what I mean? There's always an in and an out, between which there's a flow going in and making basically a participation, a synergy or a union or a bond between one element and the other element. And so these points of contact just going to consult my notes. So, okay, I could just ask you a question that turns what I just said on its head. So we're talking about points of contact, but what is the point of contact? What is the point of contact? So what we're exploring here is that the point of contact is union. It's this two-way flow that makes the two one and gives us possibility of an emergent property of something greater than the sum of the parts occurring. And the first one we're going to look at is conception. So two diverse elements, a sperm and egg, come together when the sperm penetrates the wall of the egg. And then you have an embryo starts developing. And then you have immediately, so all of these things fold on themselves as kind of metaphors for all of the others, really. And this is an instant result because we have something that is greater than the sum of the parts. We have a new living being that begins to grow. Okay, the second one is what's going on inside the womb. There's now a union of mother and the embryo. And what's happening is that between the mother and the embryo, there's a flow going via the placenta. So the semi-permeable membrane is the placenta. And here we can jump into another realm of the synergy, the communication and two-way flow between that embryo and the land. I mean, unfortunately, it's probably not very true if I take a human as an example these days. So instead, I'm going to take the example of a herd animal, like a free grazing kind of cattle on a wild landscape. So they're able to go wherever they want. And so the mother is grazing on plants, and the plants are ending up in her bloodstream, and they're coming through the placenta and into the bloodstream of the calf. So there's now a communion between the landscape and that infant cow in the womb. And then the cow is born and begins to suckle. That communion's ongoing. Through the breast milk, there's a connection between the organisms and the chemistry of them that are on the land and that baby's, that calf's own anatomy and physiology. It's one with the land, but also it's learned how to metabolize. It's learned how to interact with the chemicals of plants. And this is actually shown because herds that are restricted in their access to plants, the same kind of cow, and they can eat this same kind of plant. So just imagine a particular plant, but it's a little tricky to metabolize. It's good, but it's tricky to metabolize. And then when the land is opened out, like they open the gate, and now the cattle can get down and eat this plant, but the calf inside the womb was not exposed to it during either gestation or breastfeeding. So now when it gets out, mother knows it because she knows it from when she was young, so she's eating it. The calf kind of joins in because this is the other way that the mother is facilitating the bond between the calf and the landscape through basically culture, demonstrating, well, we eat this one, we go here and we eat this one. And so the calf tries, but it's having trouble now to metabolize this because it's chemically a little unusual, and having not been exposed to it earlier on, it's not so able to do it. So now we move on to another semi-permeable membrane, which is the lining of the gut. Now, there's all sorts of communion going on there, obviously, and by the way, the lining of your gut is skin. It's part of your skin. And I'm not sure how many of you come across the idea that you're basically like a donut. So the lining of your mouth, your throat, right down to your anus is basically the outside inside. It's an incredibly sophisticated bit of design if you think about it. We've got all of this space that's just folded in. So your outside inside, the lining of your gut, food goes down there, and you've got these tremendously helpful characters in there called your gut flora that are basically facilitating the exchange. So a lot of things they're doing down there is stuff that we can't do. They're breaking down molecules, and they're also involved in very sophisticated ways in communicating information. So they have a key role in your emotions. For example, they did horrible tests on rats where they made them completely antiseptic, and they grew up without any emotions. I mean, get your head around that. Like your capacity to feel is based on the fact that you have microorganisms in your gut. But anyway, there are then molecules being broken down, and it's like there's an outreach going on, because from the inside comes out these secretions of digestive enzymes which kind of reach out to the things that are sitting on the inside of the gut, and they kind of break them down so they can draw them in. And then, of course, the same molecules are reassembled. So there's a kind of breaking down But it's a positive thing because it's broken down in order to be rebuilt into the fabric of your body. And so, of course, that's what's happened with the plants that the mother cow ate and then that the calf ate. Yeah, so that animal's walking around. It's part of the landscape. It's made entirely of molecules that come from here. And so I like asking silly questions at the start of my talks. And when I do one for kids, I always say, where does food come from? And I'm asking this in a rural context. So you know you're going to get some sharp answers. Nobody ever says the supermarket. And they don't say packets either. So they're sharp. They go, from the farm, sir. And then one of them even just really wanted apple from the teacher. He didn't get one, but he said, from the land. Good, that's a very good answer. You're wrong. The answer I wanted, and I knew none of them was ever going to give me, was food comes from here. If you are a normal organism, not one of these newfangled, funny Homo sapiens that get pretty much all of their food from somewhere else. If you're a squirrel, or a badger, or a worm, or a skylark, or anything like that, the only thing you ever do is move around here and get your food. So that means you're made from here, basically. So that's what eating is. It's a kind of outreach that gathers in, you know, one way or another. But it makes us one, because then all of our behavior and memories and chemistry and everything is made in this place, made from this place, made by the interactions with this place. Okay. So one more. Okay. Breathing. So your lungs. This is another part of the outside of you that's in. There's a massive surface area of skin on the inside of you that touches the air and basically just swaps every time you breathe in. And every time you breathe out. You're just swapping molecules backwards and forwards. Now there's exercise we could do, which would probably be more funky if we did it outside. It'd feel more vital, I guess. But having possibly just depressed you all that you're not made from molecules that come from here, and that you're this mishmash of molecules that came from all over the place, and that doesn't make you feel very embedded, I can now cheer you up by saying, let's just breathe for a minute, because that bit of you, being one with your surroundings, is intact. Let's just breathe for a minute and think about the fact that so you're all supercharged with oxygen that came from Morecambe. So there's these little air sacs in the lungs, and then there's just crossing that barrier, that semi-permeable membrane, is oxygen and CO2 and a little bit of water all the time. Okay, so the next point of contact is face-to-face. So that's following on from birth, and I mean, you could say breast to mouth or arms to body or whatever, but the point is there's this point of contact that's fostering this bond between the mother and the child. And the key point is it's a two-way flow. So that child is learning how to be a human. When it smiles, and mum smiles back, so, oh, we do things, and then someone does something back that's either the same thing or the other side of the jigsaw puzzle kind of thing. But for a baby, it's mostly the same thing. We smile back, we mimic their face expressions. If they make a noise, we kind of make the same noise. Even if they're crying, We may go, oh, you're feeling a bit, and then we talk them, and you talk them down to where you want them to be, but you meet them where they are. So there's not much call and response in the sense of, like, if I say, how are you, Alistair? And you say, fine, thank you, or whatever. That's the other side of the jigsaw puzzle. But initially, it's all just your mirror back. And that's using an incredible thing that we have called mirror neurons. It's basically, I'm responded to, and my state matches your state, and we are together in this. I'm seen by you, you're seen by me, but also I'm kind of seen and I'm changed. That's what the baby's learning. But guess what? The mother's learning how to be a mother. I mean, obviously I've never been a mother, but I learned how to be a parent. It was a completely different kind of being a human, I found, as a result of having children. That came out of me. So there's an unfolding of what we may become through this mirroring backwards and forwards. It gets more sophisticated as we go on, and it gets to this two sides of the jigsaw thing much more as we get older. But that's a point of contact, and the thing that's passing across the semi-permeable membrane is probably, our attention, our presence. Okay, then we'll move on to the semi-permeable membrane that is at the root of our five senses. So the space at the back of your eye, the retina, there's light hitting those cells, and it's communicating information back to the back of your brain. And then your eardrum, little vibrations from sound is vibrating a series of bones that take messages to another part of your brain. And then, obviously touch, we're back to skin again. And smell, the back of your nose. And taste. If we could do that funky taste one. So the nice thing about taste, I just read a description about this the other day, and John Googled it so we could get an idea of what this actually looks like. So there are these receptor cells that are involved in your taste buds, and they do this thing that they reach out to sort of detect molecules, but they dig right deep down beneath the skin and make contact with nerves to carry the signal. But they're kind of like in and out. They're sort of straddling the barrier there. So at this point, I'm going to do a little reading from a book called The Spell of the Sensuous by a guy called David Abraham. And he's here we go. I lost my book. Okay, so this is a passage that's talking about how these things end up talking to each other, which is quite incredible. I've never really thought about this before reading this. So it says, the experiencing body is not a self-enclosed object, but an open, incomplete entity. This openness is evident in the arrangement of the senses. I have these multiple ways of encountering and exploring the world, listening with my ears, touching with my skin, seeing with my eyes, tasting with my tongue, smelling with my nose. And all of these various powers or pathways continually open outward from the perceiving body, like different paths diverging from a forest. Yet my experience of the world is not fragmented. I do not commonly experience the visible appearance of the world as in any way separable from its audible aspect, or from myriad textures that offer themselves to my touch. When the local tomcat comes to visit, I do not have any distinctive experiences of a visible cat, an audible cat, or an olfactory cat. Rather, the tomcat is precisely the place where these separate sensory modalities join and dissolve into one another, blending as well with a certain furry tactility. Thus, my divergent senses meet up with each other in the surrounding world, converging and commingling in all things I perceive. We may think of the sensing body as a kind of open circuit that completes itself only in things and in the world. The differentiation of my senses, as well as their spontaneous convergence in the world at large, ensures that I am a being destined for relationship. it is primarily through my engagement with what is not me that I affect the integration of my senses and thereby experience my own unity and coherence. And so this, it's important to note that the juxtaposition that I'm hoping to sort of build in your brains through what I'm saying is exactly one of integration. So this is talking about integration within. But I've obviously been talking to, broaching the subject of integration between us and our surroundings, whether that's in the interpersonal space or with landscapes. Whereas this machine abstraction thing is about fragmentation. So it dissolves the bonds and and causes sort of splitting and things to fall apart. So that includes within us. So we become fragmented within ourselves. And I guess the thing is that the more integrated we are within ourselves and between ourselves, the greater we have the possibility of integrating with land. And that's the thing about the cultures that we're looking back to and remembering, is that they had all three going on. You know, you had people that were integrated, you had people that were integrated with others, you had communities that were integrated with landscapes. So we're now kind of in the space really of considering these ways of being in the world which we seem to have strayed from or become separated from. And there's a big case to be made for this being a question of I'll talk about another change, which there's a big point to be made, the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture, but there's also a big case to be made around the transition from so-called pre-literate cultures, or better described as oral cultures, and literate cultures. And I've for quite some time felt quite a lot of irritation about people talking about pre-literate cultures and saying, you know, oh, they should really learn to read and write and so on. Because the fact is that indigenous people walking through the landscape can read, and they can read things that you and I can't. So, and this I highly recommend this book. It goes into a lot of depth about, you know, indigenous language being even forged by, you know, bird songs in the forest will show up as words in the language, and they see signs in terms of the tracks of animals. All kinds of traces that we would be completely oblivious to. They're reading these things. And so when I take people out on foraging walks, I consider myself, because I've learnt about edible plants, to have got some kind of ABCs, basic ABCs on this front. But I like to say to people, today we're going to learn how to speak green, because what you think is undifferentiated green stuff, these are actually plants with particular flavors and biology and so on. But, you know, hunter-gatherers, for them, the land spoke to them. And they had a sense of being nurtured by the land, and they had a sense of nurturing land. So this was a profound relationship. And they existed in a frame that we could begin to think about now under a term that people have coined called bioregionalism. And this is where culture is actually framed by the biology, the geology, the climate, and the weather of a particular area. And you have something else called terroir, which is a food culture that is an expression of the place, that is along similar lines. I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm just going to quickly allude to some of these barriers. So the plough was a barrier. We used to, it was more like a weapon, right? But it created a barrier between us and the land, because now we have a machine that we use on the landscape. It's a technology of agriculture, where we take seeds from somewhere else and we impose it on this place, rather than responding as hunter-gatherers did to what was actually coming forth from the land, from wild nature. And then we have cars and transport. Well, all of these things are the result of abstract thoughts. Machines always decontextualize. They're never in context. They're never a response to a place. They're the outworking of your idea in your head, which has got no location in place. So if you look at transport, it's always to take you somewhere else. And while you're going somewhere else, you're nowhere. You have iron around you and so on. Buildings, unfortunately, these days, they're a barrier that doesn't enable us to be here. When we have windows, that's a good thing because we have some presence through what we can see. But also written language, this is the main thesis of the book I've read out from there, is that written language created this great divorce. Now, we experience the world through the mediation of signs which have no correspondence in the natural world. Whereas previously we experienced the world through our senses, 100%. And so we expected the world to talk to us. And hunter-gatherers would listen to the wind, they'd listen to animals, they'd listen to mountains and rocks, and they would not think it strange if they came home and said, you know, the bear spoke to me today. So other barriers that have come into play are social media. So social media is an extraordinary scrambling of that face-to-face thing. There's a guy called Peter Hobson who did some research on early attachment. And what they did was they put a screen in front of the baby, mother in another room in front of a camera, and let's have the baby smile, the mother smiles back. But they screwed up the timing. The baby completely freaked out because the baby's watching the expression on the mother's face that happened a minute ago. Total scrambling. That's called I send you a text message, I put a post on Facebook, and you haven't answered yet. Now you might think that that's just, oh, you get over it, you know. Sorry, that's dysregulating. If I say, hi Roger, how are you? And you just didn't do what you just did, which was smile back, yeah? You just carried on looking at me. I think, what's going on? What's up with Roger? Is he angry with me? And that's what the non-response does. You can't help it. Our bodies respond to the cue. Either you give me the cue that you mirror back, or you don't. And every time we don't get a reply, and we mediate our relations through these techniques. And by the way, the techniques are created by people who, instead of soothing themselves with relations to other people, and I'm not trying to criticize, like, demonize autism here, but I'm just saying it's a fact that if you're autistic spectrum, you are basically making yourself feel settled by working with machines rather than getting in front of people. Those guys are reframing our creative world. That's what Silicon Valley is. Yeah. So now our whole social life is being sabotaged, and instead of this permeable membrane of face-to-face reciprocity. And then we have industrial food, which is screwing up that relationship. So the relationship that cow has with the things that it eats, I'll go into a bit more detail on that quickly. So when you eat something that gives you what you need, your body has this thing called post-ingestive feedback. It says, yeah, I like that. And by the way, I'll make a note of that because next time I need that, I'll eat some of that. And I know where it is. Yeah. So the animal goes back to that place and gets what it needs. That's called post-ingestive feedback. And there's a great man called Fred Provenza who talked about that, and he said palates connect animals with landscapes through flavor feedback mechanisms. If I had time, I'd repeat that 7 times, because when I first read it, I thought that's really good, but no idea what it means, but I'll say it one more time. Palates connect animals with landscapes through flavor feedback mechanisms. So that's a bond that's being created between us and the land. And that's why your appetite is supposed to lead you down to what's good for you. Yeah, you shouldn't be thinking, oh, I want to, but I shouldn't. You know, that's nonsense that's been created by this distorted environment in which we live. I want to because I need it. That's what biology does. It tells you what you need, you want it, you desire it, you feel satisfied. That's how it all works. Flavor chemistry screws around with that. It gives you artificial sweeteners that tell you there's sugar coming when it's not. It gives you umami flavoring in your crisps that tell you there's protein coming when it's not. And then it does mad stuff, especially American food. They put flavor chemistry into all sorts of stuff, pair it with carbs. So you think you're eating a varied diet, and you're hungry for this stuff, which ought to make you hungry for fruit, but it makes you hungry for a yogurt that's got no fruit in it. Not so bad here, but in America, that stuff's crazy. So they're basically the industrialization, and we can symbolize the impenetrable barrier with, you know, the walls of the factories and the packets that you buy it in, you know. But basically, they're putting that barrier and severing the bonds. So all of these impenetrable barriers sever the bonds, and they're dissolving the linkages and turning us to dust. So I know I'm slightly running over, but I'm just going to tell this story and finish. In the prairies in Oklahoma, right, were under indigenous land management for thousands of years. And they had this grass that went down to the ground and bound the soil together, had deep roots. And above ground there's grass, and the buffalo are an essential part of that ecology. They're eating the grass, and the buffalo have a relationship with the people there who harvest them in a very sustainable manner, and have a lot of sacredness around buffalo, a lot of respect. And so they have a covenant with land. And then the white settlers come in, and to begin with, this is very honourable, because they make a covenant with the indigenous people, and they say, we won't allow the settlement to encroach on your borders. And in fact, the US Army went in and drove the settlers out at one point, because they'd encroached on the land that was covered by this treaty, not a covenant, but the indigenous people would have seen it as a covenant. But then there came a point where they said, oh, we got to have this land now. And what they did is they came in with a plough, but the prairie had a stay of execution, because at that point technology had not advanced sufficiently, and they could not penetrate that turf with the ploughs they had. Somebody had to invent a new plough, but they did plough the ground eventually, and the rest is history, because that place turned to dust. And I think it's an incredibly powerful metaphor of the dissolving of all those different bonds that I've discussed, the roots, the ecology, the covenant between the people and land, and then the covenant between the white settlers and them. So it's all turned to dust, and that's where we are. Dust is life without linkages. It's the outcome of death and decay. All right, so in the wild world, death and decay comes, but it all comes back together again. What we're seeing now is death and decay comes, and it stays fucked, basically. Yeah, and so I'm in a position, right, because I work with plants, I hear the land talking to me. Okay, and you can sort of make of this what you will. I'm not trying to say that this is like a person like you talking. When I have nettles growing in my garden, I feel that's the land saying, hey, we're nurturing you. Because they're right close to my house. When I see all the food coming up, and I understand that these wild plants have bioactive compounds that are far in excess of anything you can get in cultivated things. And there's a diversity of them. And they all have a diversity of chemicals in. You get what I'm saying here? So my diet, instead of being 10, 15 plants from a supermarket which have had the nutrition bred out of them, I've got 100 plants that haven't had the nutrition. They're full of all kinds of stuff. And I eat all of them. And then they come, and something good's emerging called my health. I'm more extreme than the rest of my family. They've all been down for it with a cold for a week and a half. I didn't get it. And I'm experiencing tangible benefits to this. But I hear these things talking to me. I see the hawthorn berries come out. I see the acorns on the ground. And they're saying, like the words of my song, the people who are there are not there. Where's the people? Where's the people? We're here, we're feeding you. And I see the blackberries rotting on the bush as much as I can pick. I'm still, everywhere I go, there's blackberries I haven't been eaten. And I'm hungry for, how could we re-engage? And I've been trying to do it through business. Okay, we'll make an acorn product. And I've realized I'm actually crap at product development. And I'm worn out with all these things that I've got so far with. And then I'm like, oh, hawthorn's finished, now it's the acorns. I've driven myself nuts with it. I've finally resolved to... that was completely unintentional. I'd have done it on purpose. I would have done it on purpose. Anyway, so I'm just looking at okay, I'm dreaming about this. Okay, if we had a community. So I'm just doing it myself. I've got no joiner inners at the moment, but I'm harvesting the acorns. I'm harvesting the stuff. I'm making stuff with them. I'm thinking, I'll get some joiner inners soon. I'm trying to get funding for a thing with kids in the local school. I've been turned down twice. I've just resent it. Right. In the meantime, here's the beautiful thing that I want to tell you about. I did a podcast with a guy called Mark Lewis. I didn't know when I talked to him where he was coming from at all. It's just, I'd had this email from him in Arizona, Forager. Great, let's talk to you. Turns out he's got very deep and profound indigenous heritage. He's part of a tribe up there. He uses 70% of wild food in his diet. All the time he's out there, he says, I haven't got a website, I'm too busy harvesting and prepping things. I think, boy, I can learn something from this guy. And the beautiful thing is, he emails me every second day, so he does like emailing. He's got time to do that. But he's sending me the menu. He's sending what they've harvested, what they've done with it. And I'm so inspired. And there's some stuff they've got in Arizona that we've got here too. So I'm saying, Mark, what do you do with the bulrush, mate? What about dock seeds? Some crazy farmer got some dock seeds and sent them to me, and they've sat in a sack for 3 years because I don't know what to do with them. But there's indigenous heritage around that. So I don't know if you can catch what I'm trying to describe here. And that is dust coming back together. Yeah? This guy who's embedded in his indigenous heritage, it hasn't been entirely broken, and he's fighting hard. And the beautiful thing is, I fed him some information about that particular dust bowl thing that happened. There's a scientist called Jack Harlan who started doing research on the prairie grasses. Could we harvest them and get seed from them? And he got amazing stats to say, well, you know, it's not like wheat, but considering there's no inputs here, and this is a wild grain that's more nutritious, he's now going in the Public Records Office, unearthing all of Jack Harlan's work so that he can start getting it in there. So somebody in Oklahoma, regarding which nothing is happening at the moment. So this two-way flow that's going on with people and land is just exhilarating. So I'll just, one last metaphor with these spores, not dust. So we've got dust, spores, right? So if you know what happens with spores, they're just dust, they're flying everywhere, right? But these are not dead. So a spore, under the right conditions, produces a thing called a hyphae. It's a little cell growing out, and it's looking around for a compatible hyphae, fuses with it. The other ones fuse, and all of a sudden, this thing is in the mycelial net. It's underground and you can't see it, but they're bonding. They're bonding, they're bonding. Unlike everything we see now where it's seen and there's no substance, it's all above ground and there's fuck all, right? This is underground. And every once in a while, the right conditions occur and a fruiting body comes up and sheds spores. It's called Mark Lewis emailing me across the ocean. Yeah? And they're settling on me, and I'm going, okay, now we've got some model. You know, I'll get 20 people around at my house like they do because they always have, you know, and we'll cook the acorns and do this.
Where do you live?
Well, listen, there's foragers everywhere. We've got a thing called the the Association of Foragers. This is what I'm trying to say. Guys, let's stop just getting, you know, bits and bobs done here. They like charging people this and that to muck around with this stuff. Let's start community projects and get this happening all over the country, like that people engage with land through foraging. So yeah, I'm well over my time. I'm done.